Hi everyone. I'm Dale. I'm an English teacher and whole school reading and literacy lead at a secondary school in Coventry, and I've got the honour and joy of speaking to Tanika Gupta here today. Tanika, over the past 25 years, has written over 25 stage plays that have been produced in major theatres across the UK. She's a fellow of Rose Bruford College, runs courses for the Arvin Foundation, has led many playwriting workshops in UK universities, as well as for the National Theatre, Royal Court Hampstead, Young Vic, and Theatre Royal Stratford East. She's presently a visiting lecturer at the Royal Holloway University of London and Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. In 2019, her play The Empress was added to the GCSE English Literature curriculum by Pearson at Excel and is currently being performed by the RSC. I'm going to be speaking to Tanika. We'll have at the end a chance for some questions from you guys. If you want to be putting questions in the chat, I'll hopefully get to answer as many of those. Ask as many of those. I won't be answering them. Tanika will be, as we can. Before I ask my first question to Tanika, just for those of you who don't know about the play, The Empress is a play that is about Asian characters, about living in England, in London, in the 19th century during the last 14 years of Queen Victoria's reign, and about their experiences living in Britain during that time. First of all, I've been very rude and haven't actually said hello to Tanika yet. So hi, Tanika.
Hello, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, thanks.
Good. So my first question is, what and who inspired your creation of the play?
So when I was at university, a tutor was a very bad student, but a tutor did give me a book to read. And of course, I didn't read it because I was only about 19. And then 10 years later, I read it and I thought, wow. And it was a book by Rosina Vishram. And I think she'd written it in 1986. And it was called Ayahs, Lascars and Princes. And in it had a photograph of a group of Indian women from the Indian subcontinent sitting around a table in 1891 reading the Bible. And it said, Ayah's Home, 1891 Jury Street. And I thought, who on earth are these women? They look like sort of Asian Mary Poppins. They were all dressed in black and looked quite very sweet but demure. And it turned out, when I read more about it in the book, that these were ayahs who are basically nannies who looked after English colonial children, who were brought over by boat by the English to look after their kids from India. And then basically when they got to Tilbury Docks, quite often they were dumped and told, we don't need you anymore. So there were literally hundreds of destitute ayahs wandering around the streets of 19th century Britain. And it was only when the group of evangelical women opened this refuge, basically, for these ayahs, that they were able to live, have a roof over their heads. And I thought, wow, that would make a great story and a great play. And that's really where it came from. So that's the original. It's a photograph in a book that I read, basically, is the long answer.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It does make a fantastic story, and one that my students certainly have really engaged really well with. They've loved it, and I've loved teaching it. So you structured the play into 2 acts with 15 scenes each. What made you decide to make that decision in terms of the structure of the play?
Yeah, I think it's called Absolute Chaos because as I researched the play, I kept finding more and more characters that I wanted to put in the play. So many people have complained that the script reads more like a film script than a stage script because there are so many scenes and the locations shift and there are so many characters. And so really in terms of why did I structure it that way? It's I have no idea, to be honest, apart from the fact that I wanted to tell all these stories. So it wasn't just the ayahs, it was the Lascars who were the sailors. It was also the politicians. It was also Queen Victoria and her relationship with Abdul Karim. And it's interesting that it's talked about as a play about Asian characters, because actually there are quite a lot of English characters in there as well. So it's quite diverse in its casting, and it's also because I didn't want to just do an Asian play. I wanted to show that actually there were quite a lot of sympathetic English people
Mm.
in the play, including Lusker Sally, who is actually based on a real live character who did exist. There was also apparently a Calcutta Louise, but I quite like Lusker Sally's name better. So it's about friendships as well as animosities and the usual racism. But for me, the structure was very much about making sure that each story had a journey. And I guess that the second half is much more about the politician, Dadabhai Naoroji, who's the first Indian MP. So it becomes more political as the play goes on, and hopefully, kind of, climaxes with the fact that he goes back to India to fight the good fight.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting what you said about the about having quite a lot of white characters in there as well who are quite sympathetic. One of the things I found with teaching actually is that quite a lot of my students, to begin with, assume that Lascar Sally must have been Asian
Mm.
because if she was sympathetic and and spent time with the Lascars, she must have been Asian. No white person would do that. And actually, sort of like I think it's quite interesting, sort of presenting that idea of that sympatheticness. And actually, the fact that in many cases, a lot of the lower class white characters have more in common with the Asian characters than they do with the upper class white characters in the play. I think, which I find really interesting. I
Yeah.
think a lot of my pupils did as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would call it, I would say that it's about working classes, isn't it? Because actually those domestic servants like Rani and the sailor Lusker have got a lot more in common with people like Lusker Sally and even Georgina,
Mm-hmm.
or Georgie, who have to work for a living. They can't just sit around ordering other people. And so yes, you're right, absolutely, they have more in common. And so in a way, if you look forward to many years, it's about class and not about race. And those friendships do last. I mean, I was very keen to show the friendship between, for example, Feroza, the older Aya, and Lusker Sally, that goes back a long way. That they obviously know each other for the last 20 years, and actually there's a genuine friendship there.
Yeah.
And it continues with Rani. And I was very keen to show that because personally I don't live in an only Asian world, and I also have many friends and family from all walks of life, and I really wanted to kind of try and show that through the play, really, that we don't it doesn't have to all be so polarized.
No, absolutely, yeah. Um, so the play is set across, as I said earlier, across the last 14 years of Queen Victoria's reign. Why did you choose that particular period?
Well, it neatly sort of coincided with my slight obsession with that period of history, in that it was the beginnings of Indian nationalism in India. Um, so it's when the British Raj, it's when Queen Victoria basically becomes Empress of India, that the British Raj really kicks off in India. And so, in terms of the way that they're treated, the famines, all the rest of it, I was very interested in the fact that there were so many Indians running around in London in 19, oh, and not just London, actually all over the country, but certainly in London in at the end of the 19th century. So it's not just the Ayers and the Luskers. There are also all these politicians. There are students of law. And then of course there's Abdul Karim, who serves Queen Victoria in the last 14 years of her reign, which is sort of like neatly coincides with the fact that she dies in 1901. And also I think because I was commissioned by the Royal Shakespeare Company, I was sort of thinking about the play by Shakespeare, The Tempest, where they all turn up on an island, a sort of unforgiving island, and meet all these strange characters. And obviously it's nothing like The Tempest. I'm not saying that, but that was a kind of weird template in my head. It's always quite good to write with an idea of where why you're writing it. And so that's why the play begins on the boat and ends on the boat as well, so that they do leave the island, because it is an island at the end of the day, Britain. And so and it's a very small island as well, and yet it ruled so much of the world.
Mm.
So it's sort of yeah, that's the kind of template. I've wandered off from your question. Sorry, Dale.
That's all right. Interesting. You said Dadabai says some point in this in the play about why should such a small island control so much of the world,
Yeah.
and that's very much true. Actually, talking about Dadabai, again, I think that a lot of the people that I taught were really surprised to find out that we had an Asian MP in the 19th century. That's not something that they knew about, and that would have been taught in history. And again, I think a lot of them found that really interesting and found this figure that a lot of them didn't know about, had never heard of
Mm,
before, and found him a really fascinating figure because he really was, and he was one of
mm,
the great heroes of Indian independence. So
mm.
yeah, um, yeah,
Yeah,
um,
I have to say, I got slightly obsessed with him.
yeah,
Because like you say, we've never heard. I actually worked as a community worker for many years in Finsbury and Islington, and I remember coming across a little blue plaque um, with his name on it, saying that he was the MP for that area in elected in 1891. Or was it two? I can't remember. Anyway, it was just, and I remember thinking, who is this guy? I've never heard of him. And yet he was so influential on people like Gandhi and everybody else that came after him.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so why did you choose then to set most of the play in England? Well, all the bits in England, apart from the bits that are on the ship. What are the key messages about empire that you intended your play to address and convey?
Well, again, slightly skewed in that I was also thinking about my own parents who came to Britain in the 60s, in the very early 60s, and the kind of reception they got when they got here. And they were very much like, they were educated people from India. They were university graduates. They were coming to what they thought was the land of Shelley, Keats, and Byron. And they believed in British fair play and justice. And actually, I think they really, really, I mean, it's a very common story, but they really struggled with racism and ignorance and all the rest of it. And so, in a sense, the play is a bit about my parents' journey, even though it's set 100 years earlier, or not quite 100, 80 years earlier. I think that I, I, I didn't want to set it in India because I didn't want it to be about India. I wanted it to be about British experience, British history. And when people talk about it being, like it's an Asian play, you kind of go, no, actually, it's part of all of our history,
Yeah,
all of us, and many people intermarried as well
mm.
and continue to. So it's not a separate world. It's actually about all of us. So it's not about bashing anyone or anything like that, but it's about looking at interesting stories from that period.
It's interesting you talk about your parents believing that sense of of British fair play, because one thing I found quite starking is that Dadabai really believes in the sense of British fair play, and he really sort of has a lot of faith in that until quite late on into the play, and I
Mm.
find that quite interesting that maybe that was also partly because it's a reflection of what your parents believed and what they felt coming to Britain.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. They were completely shocked at the way that they were treated. They couldn't believe it. For example, this sort of common story about trying to find a house to live in and seeing a notice up on the door saying no Irish, no dogs, no coloured, or whichever way it was around. And a lot of people are saying, "Oh no, those notices never existed. That's rubbish. There's no record of it." And yet, my parents said again and again, "Oh my God, they did exist, and we couldn't get housing. We
Mm.
literally went round so many different houses." And I think that that's without going on too much about what contemporary history, it is still the fact that there were many, many people of color living in Britain at that time. So I'm only concentrating on the Indians. And when I say Indian, I mean the Indian subcontinent, because at that time, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., they were all one country. Um, and interestingly, most of the Luscars were actually Muslim. But the but the whole breadth of the sort of immigration of different people coming over to Britain was massive because it was the head of the empire. So you had freed African people who had settled in Britain from the 1820s. You had people from all over the world who came to work in Britain. So I think that the stories that we often see is not a good reflection. It's not the right reflection of what Britain was like. In terms of diversity. And if you were just to read a Dickens novel, you'd think that everybody was white in London, but actually that's not the case. And there are little hints here and there. I mean, for example, if you read Wuthering Heights, the identity of Heathcliff is really, really ambiguous. And I think that's really clever because he's talked about as a Lascar, he's talked about as a son of a Chinese emperor, and he's even talked about as an African. And he's called a tinker, which is a rather derogatory term for an Irish person. So, but Bronte never actually kind of like nails it down, and so Heathcliff's identity is quite interesting. I think there's another play there as well, actually. Who was Heathcliff?
I look forward to seeing it. Sort of linking on to that, there are some texts that that feature Black and Asian people, but often as quite docile, even when they're being mistreated. You chose to present Rani's anger and frustration in the play. I think one of the most sort of scenes that stands out the most for that is obviously when Lord Oakham is casting her out when she becomes pregnant with his child.
Yeah.
And that really stood out as a scene for me, both reading it and when I went to see it at the RSC last month. Why did you choose to present Rani's anger and frustration so sort of strongly and so clearly?
Well, I think it's about characterization. I think it's very boring if they just allow everything to wash over them and characters and not fight back. And ultimately, the Empress is Rani. That she is the center of our story. Even though Queen Victoria is the Empress of India, Rani also means queen in Bengali. So she to me is my real empress. And so I needed to have I don't like to use the word feisty. I've been told off for using that word, but certainly a sort of spirited and strong woman character is very important, because otherwise they just end up being things happening to them rather than them actually making things happen. And I think that's really important, that you can change your life.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think again,
and stand up to
Rani,
bullies, basically.
Yeah, Rani's growth though, as she becomes more and more sort of confident in sort of expressing herself and expressing her views and wanting to change the world is one of the really fantastic things I really enjoyed about the play, I think.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So one of the most compelling choices you made was to explore. We mentioned this briefly. Explore the complexity of class for most for most people, most of the characters in the play. Would you talk us through some of the features of class that you considered when writing the play?
Would I talk you through? Sorry, say that again.
The features of class that you considered when writing the play.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted, like I said before, I wanted to make it quite diverse. So in terms of, for me, the Luscars are the kind of the bottom of the pile. And what I find really interesting is, if even today, if you go to Brick Lane, for example, in East London to go and have a curry, a lot of the people that live around there are descended from the Luscars. So often they were like cooks and whatever on the boats, and they would jump ship at Tilbury Docks, and they basically settled in that area, and they married, and they had children and all the rest of it. So they were very, very badly treated by it. I mean, they literally ran the British naval system until about 47. I mean, every single fleet had Indian sailors, not just Indian, there were Africans, there were Chinese, etc. But Indians made up the bulk of the workers there. And again, their stories are not told very much, even though we have got some written evidence of this, letters, etc., that some of them were literate. But the minute you have a whole society who are not literate, they're not writing down their history. They're not. We haven't got records in Parliament about them. We have little bits and pieces here and there, and that's the thing about working class history, which is quite hard. So, for example, the Ayers have got almost nothing written about them or written by them because they didn't read and write, basically. So for me, that was really important to tell their stories first and foremost, and also to, like I said before, to show the friendships that they had with English people as well, who were in the same. Because I mean, Victorian society was pretty awful for everyone that wasn't, wealthy. I mean, we know all this from Dickens, and the workhouses and the factories and the child poverty and etc. It's very there's a wonderful description by Gandhi when he comes over as a 19-year-old to Britain in 1889, and he walks around London and he talks about how poor um, some of the slum areas are where there are working class people living. And he's really, really shaken by it. And he describes it in quite a lot of detail. So I think that those stories for me were quite important to show, and to show the friendships, as I said.
Yeah. Um, you said a lot about, there isn't a huge amount written down about, about Ayers and Lascars, etc. You did spend quite a lot of time while researching the play in the British Library. Uh, what was one of the interesting historical discoveries that you made that you featured in the play?
Oh, most of the historical discoveries, I have to say, have already been made. I was just like rummaging around, like it's actually got an India office library in the British Library. So there's lots of, I mean, I think for me it was just things like reading. I can't remember the names of everything, but certainly I read a sort of like a memoir of a lady in waiting to Queen Victoria, and talking about what she had to do every day. And so that's what Lady Sarah was based on quite a lot. I mean, to be honest, a lot of the ladies in waiting talks about how boring life was, and how all they had to do was stand around and hand over handkerchiefs, and they would often have to walk behind Queen Victoria when she went off on her jaunts to Balmoral, and it'd be freezing cold, and she would be in the coach, but they would be trudging along in their skirts. So it's all fascinating. For me, the most interesting place that I actually visited was Osborne House, which is in the Isle of Wight, and it's where Queen Victoria and Abdul Karim went. Not Abdul Karim, sorry, her husband Albert went to have their holidays, and then later on, Abdul Karim went with her to accompany her. And within Osborne House, there is a whole room which has been made in the fashion of a Indian darbar, which is like with that incredibly intricate Mughal style roof. There's a peacock throne there, like the Mughal emperors had. And on the walls, there are pictures, portraits of every single Indian servant ever worked for Queen Victoria, and there were hundreds of them. That's what was so interesting. And then the people at the Osborne House, they showed me the menu that Queen Victoria had for her dinner and she ate a lot every week, and every Friday night she had chicken curry made by Abdul Karim. And so that kind of stuff is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, I don't think it's a particular historical discovery, but it was, it's all stuff that you can use for a play.
Yeah, something very sort of modern multicultural about that, the idea of sort of like having a curry every Friday. If it
I
feels
know,
very,
I know.
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Um, Now, you mentioned briefly Lady Sarah, who's obviously one of the important characters in the play, Victoria's lady in waiting. There is quite a lot of tension between Victoria and Lady Sarah. Why did you want to present that tension?
So Lady Sarah is completely made up. She didn't exist. The actor playing Lady Sarah went off to try and find lots of information about her, and then came back looking a bit upset, saying, "I can't find anything about this woman." And I went, "That's because she doesn't exist. I just made her up." So she's basically um, like what happened during the reign of Queen Victoria when Abdul Karim came into her court was that he caused a constitutional crisis in that everybody, I mean, the real racism of the aristocracy was like absolutely came to head. They did not want this man in court. They did not want him anywhere near her. They literally thought he was going to try and assassinate her. They thought he was a lesser human being. All those, terrible, terrible racist tropes. So actually, Lady Sarah is an amalgamation of all those people in court. So she basically represents the whole of Victoria's court. Because otherwise, I would have had about another 30 characters coming in and out. So it's all on her. So she represents them. And I mean, I think that, to start with, to have her as a quite, friendly, benign sort of character, and then to show her growing hatred of Abdul Karim and also her growing resentment of him because he's basically taken over her job. She's no longer number two, he is, and she's probably number six now. And as we know, I mean, we see it all the time in looking at The Crown, for example, the series, and looking at what goes on with Meghan Markle and all the rest of it. Those kind of kind of court intrigues were just as rife then as they are now. And interestingly, Queen Victoria gave Abdul Karim the gift of Frognall Cottage, which was also given to Harry and Meghan.
Yeah.
So, but neither of them have managed to stay there very long. So, yeah.
No, I think it's been given to another member of the royal family now, I think. Talking about that, I found really interesting with Lady Sarah is that when I went to see the revival that's currently on at the RSC, you made quite a few changes to the script for the revival. Yeah. And one of the things that I noticed particularly was actually that Lady Sarah became a more sympathetic character. It felt as if rather than she was pulling the strings, that the strings of the powerful men were being, of her strings were being pulled by them. I wanted to ask you sort of what was your motivation for the changes that you made to the script for the revival that's happened this year?
It's interesting that that's how it comes across, because actually what I did when I changed it was to make those arguments even more vicious rather than less. And it's about what's great about having another production of the play is that it's about the different actors and what they bring to it. And so that's very much what Frankie Faridani, who plays Lady Sarah in this production, that's the way she chose to go, which is to make her more sympathetic, not necessarily to Abdul Karim, but to see her being a bit more torn by the decisions that she has to make, and also that she is representing Bertie, the Prince Edward, and also the rest of the court. And so she's the one that's having to get. She's the messenger basically, and that's how she plays it. And I think she does play it really beautifully. But actually, the changes show more conflict rather than less. So it's really interesting the way things shift, and it would be fascinating to see if there was another production how that Lady Sarah would be. But it's because otherwise, I think if you just played it as a nasty old goat, then there's not far to go. But if you play her slightly more sympathetically, you get more nuance and more characterization. It feels more real, I think, as well.
No, absolutely, I agree. The way that I interpreted it when I was watching it was just the case of sort of, again, a gender thing, I think, of sort of the men sort of like being in charge and control, and sort of like treating the women as puppets that they can do, they can use whatever they want to use. And that's how I interpreted it. And yeah.
No, you're right. And they're both puppets, actually, aren't they? I mean, Queen Victoria is the biggest puppet of them all.
Yeah, well, I suppose arguably you could say that's what constitutional monarchy is, really.
Exactly. So, thank you.
So there are several intertextual references made in the play. Could you share your reflections on the music and poetry included in the play and the role that played to the story you were telling?
Yeah, I mean, I always like a bit of a song and a dance in the play. I mean, it's great to actually use some of the poetry of the day, like, for example, Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden poem, which is so obnoxious, but is actually really, really illustrates how people felt about empire in terms of the British. So that was quite nice to set to music. and I wrote a extra verse, which was my version of in this production, which was my version of White Man's Burden, which is actually turning it on its head, and also the Luscas song. So I wanted to show some form of the fact that there was this Indian music that was sort of kind of similar to Irish as well. I think it just makes it more interesting as a form of entertainment, because that's what I always think about when I'm writing plays, is that I don't want to bore people. And you have to always think about when you're writing, what are those actors doing on stage? They can't just stand around making speeches all the time. Well, then they do make speeches as well. So it's always nice to be able to kind of um, to actually have music and song and dance within that, because it just lifts it for an audience. But also we use some of the music of the day as well. I mean, I think the Lasker song was actually sung by a very I don't know if anyone's heard of him before, but he was a very working class, I think he was Lancashire artist called George Formby, and he used to play the ukulele and black and white films, and he sang the song "Bless Them All." But his version is much cleaner than my version is. So
I
my
didn't know
my
that.
version is basically the Indian Lasker version.
Yeah, I didn't know that George Formby had performed that.
Yeah,
That's interesting. Yeah, I found this White Man's Burden that we mentioned. That is, I remember coming across that when I was a teenager and thinking that it was a satire, the poem, because it's so on the nose.
yeah,
It's so on the nose, and I think it sort of illustrates sort of a lot of the things that about colonialism and about sort of about racism and jingoism, that I think I find it it's really interesting. I think a lot of again studying that with my pupils, they found it really fascinating that there was this poet that was really popular, could be so on the nose about imperialism, could write a poem
yeah.
that was so sort of you know obvious about sort of the sort of thing that he was trying to say. So, but yeah, so that's really interesting. Um, yeah, I think we are now going to come to questions from the audience. So let's see if we've got questions from the audience. Yes. Um, so the first question I've got is: so there's a great text to use to teach about colonialism and empire. The player mutes a lot of narratives that are silenced. Can you comment on this silence and why you muted so many within one text? Why do you think it's important for us to know these parts of British history?
Yeah, that's a big question. So basically, I think there has been, I mean, there has been a sort of like movement to try and kind of tell history from a different perspective than the one that we've always been taught. And the thing that I'm always aware of, and I keep banging on about, is that when I was at school studying history, I never learned any of this. Never. All I learned about was Tudors and Stuarts and the First and Second World War. I didn't even know that Indians had fought in the First World War. So there was nothing of me in my learning of history. When I say me, of my community, and yet there's so many of us here. And then, secondly, in English literature, I never learned, didn't read anything by anyone of colour. And it was only when I left school that I started to read people like Toni Morrison, etc. And then you're completely exposed to a whole new different way of thinking. And I think that's what literature is so incredibly important at doing, which is about telling different stories, not always going along the same narrative. I mean, obviously, empire in a way is a terrible thing that happened to many people. And there is this whole argument at the moment going, oh, it wasn't so bad, at least the Indians got railways out of it and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of right wing backlash against it. And you see it a lot, and there's so much being written at the moment by David Olasuga, by Satnam Sangera. I think Empire Land is now being studied at schools as well, and also the Empire podcast with Anita Anand and William Dalrymple, who were talking about a different, like from the perspective of the colonized, them telling their stories as opposed to always the English telling the story of what they thought was going on. And it is shocking. It is very shocking what happened. It was brutal. It was vicious. It was like certainly in India, millions of people died in famines. Certainly in the area that my family are from, which is Bengal, I think there was something like 4 million people died from famine in 1941, I think it was. And this was overseen by Winston Churchill. So, I mean, I could go on and on, but I think these stories, what I love about writing plays is that you can tell stories from the perspective of individual characters rather than, a very heavy looking non-fiction book, which, not many of us read. And so it's about being able to tell these stories, not necessarily in a harsh way, but to show that these people were human as well. And that it's about we see it all the time around us as well, but it's also really interesting to see how people struggled when they came to this country and how people who lived here struggled as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right in terms of things. These stories being muted, actually, where we're not learning full British history. There's so much about British. If we're not learning those stories, then we're not. There's a lot that we're missing out on about British history as much as anything
Mm,
else.
mm.
So another question. So there's so much British history to engage with through the play and the issues referenced. How have students and teachers engaged with you on some of the things more dominant narratives tend to erase?
How do they
How
sorry
do they engage with you on some of the things more dominant narratives
how do they
tend
engage
to
with me? I
erase?
don't know. They write to me, I guess.
Have you had many students and teachers sort of speaking to you since it's been put onto the
No, not really.
syllabus?
I've had a few Instagram messages, and I'm not very good on Instagram, so I never even know how to respond. But no, I haven't. And I think the problem is that that in terms of this being a play text, well, it's not a problem. The fact that it's on at the theatre is great. It means that people can come and see it and it becomes live, because plays aren't written to be just read. They're to be performed, and you see things in a performance that you wouldn't necessarily. I mean, how many of us have, when we were kids, went to see Shakespeare and then it all came to life because we didn't really understand it when we read it? So I think this is the big thing, is to try and get not just my play but other plays um, produced, and so that students can go and see them. And the other thing is that with, like, for example, going to schools and talking about the work, etc., the problem is that schools don't have the money to pay for anybody to go in or to get actors in. And the only people that seem to be able to ask me whether I will go and talk to them is private schools, because they have funding to pay for us. Otherwise, it's just impossible to engage on a one-to-one basis, with schools. And I think it is a problem, and it's hopefully through the RSC resources pack and all that kind of stuff, we can redress some of that with interviews and Zoom and all the rest of it. But it's not like the old days where you could get a writer in to come and talk to a class, because there is no funding for it. There's hardly any funding for students to even go and see a play. So it's well, it's not insurmountable, but there are difficulties around it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame, really, that. But I'm sure
Yeah.
things like this are really important ways of sort of
Yeah.
trying to sort of
Yeah.
help address that balance.
Yeah.
So you depict a gulf between Victoria and the people doing her imperial bidding. She could be interpreted as being sympathetic, opening to hearing how her imperial subjects around the world are treated through her relationship with Abdul Karim. Why did you do this?
Well, because I wanted to make Queen Victoria human, and I found her a fascinating character. However much I wanted to hate her, I couldn't. Most of what she says in the play is actually verbatim, so it's from her diaries. She was quite an interesting woman. She was incredibly educated. She could read in different languages. She was learning Hindi from Abdul Karim. She was very brilliant artist. I mean, some of the paintings I saw in Osborne House were actually painted by her. So even though I come from a family of, empire hating people. Just like I kept coming back to the fact that she's quite an interesting woman, and maybe she is also a bit of a puppet, in that she never went anywhere. I think the furthest she travelled was actually to Nice in France. So there she was, the Empress of India, Empress of all of, you know, India and various other African continent in the African continent, but she'd never stepped foot out of anywhere. And actually, a lot of her court were uh, deposed Indian princes, deposed African princes, etc., etc. So she obviously had a thing about wanting to know her subjects. Having said that, she's still Empress of India, and she was the head of one of the most vicious empires out there. And I think that makes it quite interesting. It's not that I'm sympathetic to the crown or constitutional monarchy. I'm more sympathetic to her as a human being and her friendship with Abdul Karim, because that's the way in. Because I think also a lot of people come out of the show going, "Oh, she was great, wasn't she, Queen Victoria?" And I think I'm not sure that's what I wanted to come across. I think that actually it's all there in that she, the stuff that is being done in her name is horrific. We mentioned Benin, we mentioned Uganda, we mentioned Rhodesia, we mentioned India as well. So these are things that are, if you read between the lines, you can see that she's, as a human being, she's sympathetic, but not what she done, what's done in her name.
And there's an inherent contrast there between the sympatheticness of her character and the fact that she did have this close relationship with Abdul. She was, trying
Yeah,
to learn as much about her empire, and yet
yeah,
the awful things that were being done in her name. So,
yeah,
and again, it's a really fascinating thing, that I think.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, you use lots of different languages in the play, and that obviously helps sort of connect to bring in different knowledge and value systems and cultures. Um, why do you think it was important to include those the different languages that you did?
Uh, so different languages as in Indian languages, or
Yeah, so I assume that's what the
yeah,
question. Yeah.
yeah. So in the new production, we actually have not used any different languages. um, so this play was originally written over 10 years ago, and now it feels, the times feel a bit different. So interestingly, in the first production in 2013, all the Asian characters had Indian accents. In this production, they don't have Indian accents apart from when they're speaking to English people. And so for that reason, I took out all of the Indian language, because I thought, actually, if they were speaking to each other, if you have all your Luscars in one room together talking to each other, they wouldn't be speaking in an Indian accent. They would be speaking their own language. But we can't have them speaking their own language, because then nobody would understand what they were saying. So we actually took out all the language, Indian languages, just because it just felt like it wasn't really telling the right story. Um, and I know, certainly with my Caribbean friends as well, we often go into a little bit of patois every now and then. And the same with Indians, they often speak a sentence in their language. But I'm really, really conscious of not wanting to alienate anybody in the audience. I think the minute you start speaking in another language, people in the audience, some will get it and others will go, "Well, I didn't get that," because you can't have subtitles on the stage in the way that you can in film. Well, you can have subtitles, but that costs so much money that nobody wants to do it. So it's about performing for a modern audience, basically.
I found it quite interesting in the scene when I went to see it last month in the Aya home,
Yeah,
where they're together, the
yeah,
Ayers, and they're talking in with British accents, and then
yeah,
when the people come to tour the Aya home,
yeah.
they do drop it. You do quite notice quite a lot of them going into that sort of Indian
They
accent.
go into
I
their
find that
own
quite
language.
interesting.
I mean, and also I was very aware that when I was growing up, my parents had an Indian accent. But to me, I couldn't hear it. I couldn't see what everyone else was going on about,
Mm.
that they had this accent, because obviously we spoke Bengali at home, so I didn't really understand. And I remember very clearly somebody saying to me, "Oh, when your mum talks, I can't understand a word she says." I remember thinking, she speaks fluent English. What is wrong with you? It's just an accent. And it's about how we're heard as opposed to who we are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think we probably have time for one more question. Um, what other texts would you recommend for students or teachers to read alongside The Empress, and why?
Well, the one that I was talking about was Ayers, Luscas and Princes. So she was an Ilia teacher in the 70s, and she found it very frustrating that none of her Asian kids in her class knew anything about their history in this country. So she literally wrote the book, and so it's a very easy text to read because it's not an academic book, which is probably why I read it and it's got lots of great pictures in it. But it's a very brilliant book. And the other book I would say is Empire Land by Satnam Sanghera, which is also very accessible and tells the history as it is, really.
Yeah, I've read that. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Right, we have pretty much run out of time, so I think we're going to need to say goodbye. Thank you so much, Tanika, for talking to me.
Thank
It's been
you.
a
Thank
joy
you
and
for
an
having me.
honour. So thank you very much. And
Okay.
I will hand you back to our hosts.
And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who's attended this first secondary session for the Lit in Colour Teacher Conference. We are going to be sending out the book bundles next month, so please make sure that you've scanned the QR code, you've entered in your details so that you can be entered into the prize draw. We have a number of free resources on the Lit in Colour pages of penguin.co.uk. They are also available on the TES Black Experiences Hub Lit in Colour pages, so do make sure that you download them, engage with them. We've got videos from authors like Nazneen Ahmed Patak, who's going to be on later this afternoon, and other authors like Avni Doshi reading extracts, as well as activities to do with your students.
Also, don't forget to head over to the Twinkles Lit in Colour pages and the TES Lit in Colour pages to find the accompanying resources for this event. There is a resource for City of Soul and Magic, The Empress, and Girl, Woman, Other that details some key features of each text if you're considering auditing and amending your curriculums to include one of these texts. The teachers from the reflective sessions have also kindly compiled some top tips that they considered while engaging with the process of diversifying their curriculum content. These tips are great for personal use and can also be shared with your departments. Following this session, we will send, your departments. There will be opportunities following this session, we will send an evaluation form as it's our first Lit in Colour teacher conference. We would really appreciate if you would fill it out so that we can use your feedback to inform our approach to future events. Thanks again for your time and your engagement, and thanks to TES, our partner for this event. We hope you have a wonderful start to this new school year and are able to make some meaningful changes to your curriculum and classroom choices. If you're planning to join the primary session following this, you'll need to use the primary link on the email from TES, and we look forward to seeing you at 2 p.m. Bye.